I would interpret this, in my analysis, to mean that NATO really wants to open up Ukrainian civil society to the private interests of the Western military-industrial complex. If we think more critically and in line with reality, with what NATO truly is and what it represents and what it actually does in the world, I would posit that that is a far more accurate definition of what they mean by opening up the national defense programs to civil society. So it turns out that with a little bit of online searching, I was able to find NATO's plans for Ukraine, which have been available publicly online since at least 2016. And if we take a very critical look at these plans, the current crisis in Ukraine starts to make a lot more sense. And it doesn't really align with anything that those so-called experts on mainstream media are trying to sell us on in terms of protecting democracy and territorial integrity and rights of the people to live freely and securely and peacefully. In fact, we can see something rather different playing out here in Ukraine just by analysing these plans. I'm Stuart Hooper, a lecturer in political science and PhD researcher, looking at international political problems just like this one, not from the left, not from the right, but from a position that can think clearly, pragmatically, and critically of what is actually going on and the true power structures that are involved in these sorts of issues. Because it is certainly not the Republicans or the Democrats or the Conservatives or the Labour Party in the US and the UK. This has something to do with a far larger agenda. And we can see that pretty clearly in these plans that NATO has for Ukraine. So let's look at the most important aspects of this NATO liaison office in Ukraine. First off, look at this list of tasks. They want to, NATO that is, liaise, advise, and facilitate changes in Ukraine. Facilitate is the most interesting and important aspect of that list of tasks, because they're not just thinking about what they might want to do in Ukraine, they are actually trying to implement those plans in Ukraine. And remember, this country is not a member of NATO, yet NATO is trying to implement, trying to facilitate its plans in Ukraine. And as we shall see, this is being done with the Ukrainian government hand in hand with NATO in this process. But let's jump to the most important aspect of this list of priorities that the NATO Liaison Office has for Ukraine. Starting off, let's look at this one. Supporting the transformation and democratic governance of defense and security. Well, what precisely does that mean for Ukraine? What does it mean to have democratic governance of defense and security? Well, let's take a look. Strengthening the democratic management of Ukraine's defense and security apparently means expert engagement and training civil servants. In other words, not a whole lot of democratic control. That means bringing in experts, technocrats, to make all of the most important decisions in terms of defense and security, and then creating a bureaucracy, that trained civil servant staff, to implement the decisions of the experts, of the technocrats. Does that sound democratic to you? Doesn't really to me. But an even more important part of this priority to transform the democratic governance of Ukraine's defense and security is this aspect. NATO wants to strengthen the impact of civil society on national security and defense issues. Does this mean that NATO really cares about what the Ukrainian people think about national defense and security, and they want the people's voice to be heard when it comes to the national security situation for Ukraine? I would say no. I would interpret this, in my analysis, to mean that NATO really wants to open up Ukrainian civil society to the private interests of the Western military-industrial complex. If we think more critically and in line with reality, with what NATO truly is and what it represents and what it actually does in the world, I would posit that that is a far more accurate definition of what they mean by opening up the national defense programs to civil society. Because of course civil society in the Western world really is dominated by transnational corporations, transnational elites, and the individual citizen really doesn't have a voice on any of this stuff. So why should it be any different at all in Ukraine? I really don't think it's gonna be. And another priority here, which is particularly interesting for NATO to have for Ukraine, considering Ukraine is not a member of NATO, it is a priority for NATO to create effective interoperable commands at a strategic and operational level, and deployable interoperable sustainable capabilities at the operational and unit level. For all intents and purposes, that means that NATO is trying to subsume Ukraine into a transnational military system that essentially removes the sovereign control that NATO has over its own military and gives it to NATO. It takes it out of the hands of Ukrainians, gives it to NATO, puts it into this interoperable system. Sounds all well and good for the strategic and operational and unit levels, right? They use all these terms to dress this stuff up and make it sound like it actually means something to do with defense. What it really means is giving up your country's sovereignty in terms of military and national defense issues to this transnational entity called NATO. And we see this all reflected in this other document, which the Ukrainians themselves have supposedly produced. We'll note that it bears striking resemblance to the plan from 2016, this one from 2020. Let's take a look at this and see what's going on here. So just look at these first 2 points. Enhancement of the process aimed at meeting NATO membership criteria by accelerating domestic reform implementation. Transition of security and defense sector of Ukraine to NATO standards and improvement of interoperability of the Ukrainian armed forces with the respective NATO ones. So let's not state this in any uncertain terms. The Ukrainian government has been attempting to change how its government works, how Ukraine works on a domestic level to meet foreign transnational standards for an institution that it is not even a member of. I wonder just how many Ukrainians are actually aware that this has been going on. And I wonder just how many of them actually agree to harmonize the legislation of Ukraine with that of NATO member states in the sphere of security and defense. So that's an interesting question to ponder, but I think most importantly, all of this stuff really goes to help explain why Russia is so angry right now and why there is a big time crisis between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians have said repeatedly that they do not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO, that they want to work out some other kind of deal that involves the Western world and the Russians and the Ukrainians. But all the time, behind the scenes, although publicly available, if you take just a few seconds to look behind the curtain, as we've done here, you can see that both NATO and the Ukrainian government have been working to change how Ukraine works at an institutional level to align the country with NATO anyway. So even the fact that Ukraine isn't an official member, it's been making the sorts of moves and changes that you would expect expect from a fully fledged member of NATO? Perhaps now we can understand why Russia is really kind of at the edge of its red line on this whole issue. So hopefully this analysis was somewhat useful in taking a peek behind the curtain at what is really going on in Ukraine. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe for more of this sort of analysis. Behind the curtain is really where we need to spend most of our time to actually understand what is really going on in these situations. We can't just take the politicians' word for it whenever they make these wild claims, as was just made with these false flag positions which were claimed by the American government, for instance. Please go ahead and like the video, leave me your comments, which I love to reply to and hear from all of you in the comments. Usually get some really great points, which I always appreciate. Stick around, I'll be back with more content this week where we dive into probably another document on Ukraine and the West's plans for Ukraine. This one coming out of the Atlantic Council. Otherwise, we will get to the most important breaking news headlines of this week, which I'm sure there will probably be some at some point, given the current state of the world. Thanks you guys for watching, and I'll be back real soon.